Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something that has haunted military strategists for centuries. Something that has toppled empires and ruined more breakfasts than you can possibly imagine. I'm talking, of course, about birds. But not just any birds. Tonight, we're going to revisit the summer of 58 BC, when a group of Roman soldiers stationed in what is now northern Italy managed to do something that no enemy army had ever accomplished. They accidentally declared war on a flock of sparrows and lost. Now, before you get too comfortable, I should warn you that this is not a story of glorious victory or heroic last stands. This is a story about heat exhaustion, poor decision-making, and the terrifying realization that nature doesn't care how many provinces you've conquered. If you're the kind of person who thinks the Roman Empire was all marble columns and eloquent speeches, well, you're about to discover what happened when legionaries tried to get a good night's sleep in a world without air conditioning, mosquito nets, or earplugs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting, or perhaps somewhere boring at 3 in the morning, drop a comment and let me know where you are. I always find it strangely comforting to imagine all of you scattered across the planet, each in your own little cocoon of blankets and darkness, listening to me ramble about things that happened 2,000 years ago. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let me paint you a picture of Cisalpine Gaul. In the summer of 58 BC, you have to understand, this wasn't Rome itself, with its fountains and shaded colonnades, and slaves fanning you with palm leaves. This was the frontier, the kind of place where civilization ended and the barbarians began. Though technically, the barbarians were still a few miles north, nervously watching the legions set up camp. The Romans had been here before, of course, but this time was different. This time, they were under the command of Gaius Julius Caesar, a man whose ambition was matched only by his talent for writing about himself in the third person. And it was hot. I mean, really, truly, historically hot. The kind of heat that makes you understand why Mediterranean cultures invented the siesta. The kind of heat that turns your armor into a personal oven and makes your wool tunic feel like it was woven from the fur of sun-addicted bears. The local Gauls, who had been living here for generations, just shrugged and stayed in the shade. But Romans had things to do. Romans had to build forts, dig ditches, patrol borders, and generally look impressive in case anyone got any ideas about rebellion. The camp they built was standard military issue, rectangular, with defensive walls, watchtowers, and rows upon rows of leather tents, arranged with the kind of geometric precision that would make a modern city planner weep with joy. Each tent slept 8 men, 8 sweaty, grumpy men, who hadn't had a proper bath in weeks, and were starting to develop theories about which of their tentmates snored loudest. The officers had proper buildings, of course, with actual roofs made of wooden beams and clay tiles. And it was these roofs that would become the flashpoint for one of the most absurd conflicts in military history. Because on those roofs, in the gaps between the tiles, the local sparrows had decided to nest. Now, when I say sparrows, you might be picturing the tiny, harmless birds that hop around park benches, looking for crumbs. And you'd be right, actually. They were exactly that. Small, brown, utterly unremarkable in every way. But they were also numerous, determined, and apparently completely unimpressed by Roman military might. Every morning, just before dawn, they would begin their chorus. Not the romantic birdsong you hear in movies, where a single nightingale serenades a lovesick maiden. No, this was thousands of tiny beaks all screeching at once. A cacophony of chirps and trills that sounded like nature's most aggressive alarm clock. The soldiers, who had been up late the night before doing soldier things, standing watch, sharpening swords, complaining about the heat, were not amused. You have to imagine what this must have felt like. You're 22 years old, you're from a sleepy farming town in southern Italy, and you joined the legions because the recruiter said you'd see the world and get rich from plunder. Instead, you're in mosquito-infested Gaul, sleeping on a straw mat that smells like the previous 8 occupants, and every single morning, at the exact moment when your dreams are finally pleasant, 1,000 tiny throats erupt in what can only be described as feathered chaos. For the first few weeks, the soldiers just grumbled. They'd wake up, throw their sandals at the roof, miss entirely, and stumble off to morning formation. But as the heat wave continued and tempers grew shorter, the grumbling turned to muttered threats, and the muttered threats turned to actual plans. Someone, somewhere, made a decision that would echo through history, or at least through the pages of one obscure military diary that somehow survived 2,000 years. That decision was simple. Enough was enough. The birds had to go. The officer tasked with solving the bird problem was a man named Lucius Vipsanius, a junior tribune who had drawn the short straw during morning briefing. You have to understand something about the Roman military hierarchy. There were officers who planned campaigns, officers who led charges, officers who negotiated with enemy chieftains, and then there were officers like Lucius, who got assigned to things like resolve the sparrow situation, because nobody else wanted to do it. Lucius was, by all accounts, a perfectly competent administrator. He could organize supply lines, calculate rations, and write reports in the kind of elegant cursive that made his superiors nod approvingly. What he could not do, as it turned out, was predict the behavior of small birds with grudges. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. His initial assessment of the problem was straightforward. Birds were nesting in the roof tiles. Birds were making noise. Therefore, remove the nests, remove the noise. Simple, logical, very Roman. He summoned a contubernum, that's 8 soldiers. For those of you who don't spend your free time reading about Roman military organization, and gave them their orders. Climb the roofs, clear out the nests, and make sure the birds don't come back. The soldiers, whose names history has mercifully forgotten, received these orders with the enthusiasm of men who had just been told to clean latrines with their toothbrushes. It was, after all, the middle of summer. The roofs were hot enough to fry eggs on, and the birds were not exactly cooperating with the evacuation plan. But orders were orders, and so they grabbed their tools, mostly just their hands, and some sticks, and began the great nest removal of 58 BCE. Now, here's where things get interesting. If you've ever tried to remove a bird's nest from a location that birds have carefully selected over generations, you'll know that birds are not passive participants in this process. They do not watch you destroy their homes with philosophical detachment. They do not nod understandingly and begin searching for new accommodations. Instead, they do what any creature does when its home is attacked. They fight back. At first, the resistance was mostly symbolic. The sparrows would circle overhead, chirping angrily, occasionally swooping low enough to make a soldier duck. The soldiers laughed it off, made jokes about aggressive pigeons. They weren't great at bird identification. Continued their work. Nest after nest was pulled from the tiles, scattering twigs, feathers, and the occasional egg across the ground below. By midday, the job was done. The roofs were clear. The soldiers descended, dusted themselves off, and reported to Lucius that the bird problem had been solved. Lucius, pleased with this efficient execution of orders, made a note in his daily report. Nest removal completed. Troops performed adequately. Bird situation resolved. He then went to find some lunch and probably took a nap, because even junior tribunes needed rest in that heat. That night, the soldiers settled into their tents with a sense of quiet satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, they thought they would sleep past dawn. No chirping, no screeching, just blessed, uninterrupted silence. They drifted off with smiles on their faces, dreaming of cool breezes and cold beer. They were, of course, catastrophically wrong about everything. The first soldier to wake was a Gaulish auxiliary named Bel, who had joined the Romans because it seemed like a good career move, and who now deeply regretted every decision that had led him to this moment. He woke to a sound that he initially thought was hailstones hitting the roof. But there was no storm coming. The night sky was clear and full of stars. The sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A rhythmic percussion that seemed to come from every direction at once. He sat up, listened for a moment, and then did what any sensible person would do when faced with an unexplained noise in the middle of the night. He woke the guy next to him and made him listen to. The second soldier, a grizzled veteran from Spain named Marcus, had seen 20 years of military service. He'd fought Gauls with swords bigger than his legs. He'd survived plague outbreaks that killed half his cohort. He'd marched through mountain passes in winter with nothing but his cloak and his determination. But nothing in his 20 years of service had prepared him for the sound of 1,000 angry birds, systematically pecking at clay roof tiles. By now, the entire tent was awake, and so were the occupants of every other tent in that section of the camp. Men stumbled out into the night, squinting up at the roofs. And what they saw would have been almost beautiful if it weren't so terrifying. The sky was full of thousands of them. They covered the rooftops like a living blanket, their tiny beaks working away at the tiles with a determination that seemed almost personal. The birds weren't just making noise. They were actively destroying the roofs. Clay tiles, which had been carefully laid to keep out rain and snow, were being shifted, cracked, and in some cases completely dislodged by the coordinated assault. Every few minutes a tile would slide off and shatter on the ground below, adding to the chaos and the growing pile of debris, and through it all, the chirping continued. But it wasn't the cheerful morning chirping the soldiers had grown to hate. This was different. This was a low, constant, almost musical hum of communication. As if the birds were coordinating their attack, sharing intelligence, adjusting their strategy it was the sound of nature deciding that it had had enough of Roman architecture. Lucius Vipsanius was awakened by his adjutant, who shook him gently and then, when that didn't work, poured a cup of water on his face. The tribune sputtered awake, ready to be angry, but the look on his adjutant's face stopped him cold. "Sir," the man said, "you need to see this." What Lucius saw, when he stumbled outside in his sleeping tunic, was the beginning of a siege. His camp, his orderly Roman camp with its perfect geometry and disciplined routines, was under attack by creatures that didn't care about geometry or discipline or the fact that Rome had conquered most of the known world. The birds had declared war, and they were winning. And somewhere in the night, perched on a roof beam and watching the chaos below, a single sparrow tilted its head and chirped what might have been, if you were inclined to anthropomorphize, a sound of pure satisfaction. The morning after the first night attack revealed the true scale of the damage. Tiles lay shattered in the narrow streets between barracks. Roof beams, exposed to the elements for the first time in months, showed signs of peck marks that nobody wanted to examine too closely, and the soldiers themselves stumbled around, with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men who had spent the night listening to an orchestra of destruction performed by creatures with absolutely no respect for human sleep schedules. Lucius Vipsanius convened a meeting of his senior centurions, though senior is a relative term when you're all running on 3 hours of broken sleep, and the kind of irritability that comes from realizing you've started something you might not be able to finish. The meeting took place in Lucius's quarters, which had somehow escaped the worst of the attack, though even here, the occasional peck against the roof tiles served as a constant reminder that the birds were still out there, still watching, still waiting. "Options," Lucius said flatly. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. The first centurion, a thick-necked veteran named Publius, who had earned his position by being too stubborn to die in battle, spoke first. "We kill them. All of them. Nets, slings, arrows, whatever it takes. We wipe them out. And the problem solves itself." This suggestion was met with nodding from several of the younger officers, who had not yet learned that nature has a way of making you regret declarations of total war. Lucius, to his credit, saw the flaw immediately. "And how many birds are we talking about, exactly?" he asked. "Have you counted them? Have you estimated the population? Because from what I saw last night, there are more of them than there are of us, significantly more, and they can fly, which gives them a tactical advantage that arrows and slings don't entirely negate." Publius opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He was a man who solved problems by hitting them until they stopped being problems. But even he could see that hitting birds was going to be logistically challenging. The second centurion, a more thoughtful man named Cassius, who had actually read books about things other than military tactics, offered a different approach. "We could try scaring them. Fake predators. Owl statues, maybe, or something that moves in the wind. The Gauls use something similar to protect their grain stores." Lucius considered this. It wasn't a terrible idea. Birds were stupid. Everyone knew that. They could be fooled by simple tricks, by things that looked dangerous but weren't. A few well-placed owl effigies, and the sparrows would flee in terror. It was elegant. It was cheap. It was exactly the kind of solution that a junior tribune could implement without having to bother his superiors with inconvenient details. "Do it," he said. "Find someone who can carve owls. Put them everywhere, and let's hope this ends quickly." What Lucius didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the sparrows of Cisalpine Gaul had evolved alongside real owls for thousands of generations. They knew exactly what owls looked like, sounded like, smelled like, and they knew, with the unshakable certainty of prey animals, that the statues suddenly appearing on their rooftops were not owls at all. They didn't move. They didn't hunt. They didn't make the soft hooting sounds that sent genuine chills through the sparrow community. They were just there, useless, insulting even. In their obvious fakeness, the soldiers spent the day constructing and placing the owl statues. It was almost fun, a break from the usual routine of training and patrols, and pretending to be afraid of Gauls who were, frankly, more afraid of them. They carved from wood when they could find it, shaped from clay when they couldn't, and in one memorable case, tried to fashion an owl from spare helmet parts, and spare helmet parts do not make convincing owls, as anyone could have predicted. By evening, Every roof in the affected section of camp had at least one owl effigy perched upon it. The soldiers stood back, admired their work, and went to bed with the confidence of men who had outsmarted nature. They woke at midnight to the sound of laughter. Not human laughter, of course, but something that, in their half-asleep state, sounded disturbingly close. The birds were back, and they had brought friends. The owl statues had been knocked over, pecked apart, or in some cases, completely removed from the roofs and deposited in the streets below. And perched among the sparrows, watching the chaos with obvious amusement, were actual owls, real ones, drawn by the commotion, perhaps, or simply curious about why their likenesses were being displayed so prominently. They had joined the gathering, and were now contributing their own hoots to the nighttime symphony. One soldier, a young recruit from Rome, who had joined the legions because his mother wanted him out of the house, swore he saw a sparrow land on an owl's head and chirp directly at him. This was probably a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation, but, in the moment, it felt terrifyingly real. Lucius, watching from his window, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Genuine, soul-deep exhaustion mixed with the creeping realization that he had no idea what to do next. The owl's strategy had failed. The nest removal had failed. Everything he tried seemed to make the problem worse, as if the birds were learning from each encounter, adapting to each new threat. He thought about writing a report to Caesar. He imagined the great general reading it, imagining the look on his face, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that preceded either laughter or fury, and decided that perhaps, for now, this could remain a local matter. There had to be another way. There had to be something the Romans hadn't tried yet. Outside, the birds continued their celebration, and somewhere in the darkness, a sparrow chirped what might have been the opening notes of a victory song. The third day of what the soldiers had now begun calling the Bellum Passerum, the war of the sparrows, dawned hot and bright and full of terrible possibilities. Men emerged from their tents like creatures crawling from graves, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and deliberate. Sleep deprivation had transformed the once proud legionaries into something resembling the living dead, and their mood had soured accordingly. Lucius Vipsanius had not slept at all. He had spent the night at his window, watching the birds, taking notes, trying to understand the patterns of their attack, and he had noticed something that disturbed him more than the actual destruction. The birds were organized, not just chaotic mobs acting on instinct, but something closer to a coordinated force. They arrived in waves, relieved each other at regular intervals, and seemed to target specific areas of the camp with deliberate precision. This was impossible, of course. Birds didn't have strategies. They didn't plan campaigns or coordinate troop movements. They were animals, driven by nothing more than instinct and hunger, and the simple urge to survive. And yet, as Lucius watched the night unfold, he found it increasingly difficult to maintain his rationale. Roman understanding of the natural world. The soldiers, meanwhile, had reached their breaking point. A group of them had gathered near the camp's central well, clutching cups of water and the kind of desperate hope that comes from utter exhaustion. They talked in low voices, casting occasional glances at the roofs where their tormentors perched, watching them with what seemed like genuine interest. "I say we burn them out," one soldier muttered. "Torches, set the roofs on fire. Let them burn." "Brilliant," another replied. "And then we can explain to Caesar why half the camp burned down because we couldn't handle a few birds. I'm sure that conversation will go wonderfully. Then what? We just let them win. Let them keep us awake every night until we're too exhausted to fight. Because that's where this is heading. In case you haven't noticed, we're losing." To sparrows, the word hung in the air, heavy with humiliation. Romans did not lose. Romans conquered. Romans built roads and aqueducts and legal systems that lasted millennia. Romans did not admit defeat to creatures small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. And yet, it was around midday that the situation took another turn, as if the universe had decided that simple sleep deprivation wasn't enough of a punishment. A supply convoy arrived from the south, bringing food, equipment, and worst of all, news. Caesar himself was planning to inspect the camp within the week. He wanted to see how his troops were settling in, how training was progressing, how the local situation was developing. He wanted, in other words, to see a functional military installation staffed by alert, disciplined soldiers ready to continue the conquest of Gaul. What he would actually find, if things continued as they were, was a camp full of exhausted zombies who jumped at shadows and couldn't concentrate long enough to form a proper battle line. The birds had to go, and they had to go now. Lucius called another meeting, but this time he didn't bother with the centurions. He went straight to the camp's engineer, a Greek named Archidamos, who had been captured years ago. and had since made himself useful designing catapults and siege equipment. The Greeks, Lucius had noticed, often had strange ideas about the natural world, ideas that sometimes worked when Roman common sense failed. Archidemos listened to the problem with the polite attention of someone who had been forced to listen to many Roman problems over the years. When Lucius finished explaining, the Greek stroked his beard thoughtfully and said nothing for a long, uncomfortable moment. "You're thinking of this wrong," he finally said. "You're treating it as a military problem, but it's not. It's an architectural problem. The birds nest on the roofs because the roofs are attractive to them. The roofs are attractive to them because of the gaps between the tiles. Eliminate the gaps. Eliminate the nesting sites, and the birds will go elsewhere." Lucius stared at him. "You want me to redesign the roofs? I want you to let me redesign the roofs. I have some ideas. Materials that birds don't like. Textures they find uncomfortable. We can't kill them, or that's impossible, as you've discovered, but we can make them want to leave. It's the difference between conquering a territory and making it uninhabitable for your enemies." It was, Lucius had to admit, a compelling argument, and at this point, he was willing to try almost anything. He gave Archidemos permission to proceed, along with whatever resources he needed. The Greek engineer smiled, bowed slightly, and set to work. His first idea was simple but clever. Mix something unpleasant into the clay used to seal the roof tiles. Something that would irritate bird feet, or smell bad, or ideally both. He experimented with various substances: crushed garlic, strong herbs, even a type of local fungus that produced an astonishingly offensive odor when heated by the sun, but nothing seemed to deter the sparrows for more than a few hours. Then, he remembered something from his childhood in Athens. His grandmother used to hang strings of dried chili peppers around her garden to keep birds away from her vegetables. The peppers didn't hurt the birds, but something about the smell, the texture, the residual oil on their feet, made them avoid the area entirely. It was, his grandmother had claimed, the only method that actually worked. Archidemos sent soldiers to search the local markets for chili peppers. They returned with baskets full of small, red, terrifyingly potent specimens that made their eyes water just from being in the same room. The engineer ground them into a paste, mixed the paste with clay, and began applying the mixture to a test section of roof. The results were immediate and dramatic. Birds that landed on the treated tiles would perch for a moment, then launch themselves into the air with what looked like genuine alarm. They would shake their feet, rub their beaks against nearby branches, and generally behave like creatures who had just touched something deeply unpleasant. Within hours, the treated section was completely bird-free. Lucius watched the test with something approaching religious awe. "It works," he whispered. "It actually works." "Of course it works," Archidemos replied, perhaps a bit smugly. "My grandmother was not a woman to be argued with. Now we just need to treat every roof in the camp, and hope the birds don't figure out a workaround." It was that last phrase, "hope the birds don't figure out a workaround," that should have given Lucius pause. But in his exhaustion and relief, he let it slide. The solution was here. The war was over. Soon, they would sleep. He had no idea that the sparrows were already watching, already learning, already adapting to this new threat with the same determination they had shown throughout the conflict. The war wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. The chili pepper paste application began at dawn the next day, with the enthusiasm of men who had finally found a weapon that worked. Soldiers smeared the mixture onto roof tiles with reckless abandon, their eyes streaming, their noses running, their skin tingling from the fumes. It was miserable work, but it was miserable work with a purpose, and that made all the difference. Archidemos supervised the operation with the quiet pride of an engineer whose grandmother's wisdom was finally receiving the recognition it deserved. He had calculated exactly how much paste would be needed, how thick it should be applied, how long it would take to dry in the summer heat. Every detail had been considered, every variable accounted for. This was, he felt, his finest work since designing a catapult that could throw pig carcasses over enemy walls. A story for another time. By midday, the main barracks were finished. By evening, the officers' quarters were complete, and as the sun set over the camp, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the soldiers gathered to watch the birds' reaction. At first, nothing happened. The sparrows went about their evening routines, swooping and perching and chirping as they always did. But then, one by one, they began to land on the treated roofs, and one by one, they began to leave, shaking their feet, rubbing their beaks, looking genuinely offended by the experience. Within an hour, the roofs were empty. The birds had retreated to the trees outside the camp, where they perched in silent, watchful groups, clearly unhappy with this turn of events. The soldiers cheered. They hugged each other. They lifted Archidamus onto their shoulders and carried him around the camp like a conquering hero. Lucius watched from his window, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction. For the first time in days, he felt something other than exhaustion and dread. He felt hope. That night, the camp was quiet. No pecking, no chirping, no coordinated attacks from above. The soldiers settled into their beds with the profound relief of people who had forgotten what peace felt like. They slept. They actually slept. For 3 hours, at midnight. The scratching started again, but it was different this time. Quieter, more experimental. The birds had returned, but they weren't attacking the roofs directly. Instead, they were testing the edges, the untreated gaps, the places where the chili paste had been applied too thinly, or had cracked in the heat. They were, in other words, looking for weaknesses, and they were finding them. Archidamus had done his work well, but he had made one critical assumption, that the birds would simply give up and go away. He had not considered the possibility that they might adapt, that they might learn to avoid the treated areas while still accessing the parts of the roof that mattered. He had underestimated his opponent, and now the bill was coming due. The soldiers woke slowly, groggily, unsure at first whether the sounds they heard were real or just echoes of old nightmares. But as the scratching grew louder, more persistent, more widespread, the truth became impossible to ignore. The birds were back. They had found a way, and they seemed angrier than before. Lucius stumbled outside to find Archidamus already there, staring up at the roofs with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "This shouldn't be happening," the Greek muttered. "The paste should work. It does work. I saw it work." "Apparently, they've learned to work around it," Lucius replied, too tired even for sarcasm. "Congratulations. Your grandmother's method created smarter birds." The situation was worse than it first appeared. The birds hadn't just returned to the roofs, they had brought reinforcements. The original sparrows had been joined by other species, drawn by the commotion, were simply curious about why so many of their kin were gathering in one place. Starlings darted through the air in synchronized waves. Pigeons cooed from every available perch. Even a few crows had arrived, their dark shapes looming like harbingers of doom in the moonlight. It was, Lucius realized, no longer a conflict between Romans and it was a conflict between Romans and every bird in the region. And the birds were winning. One of the crows, bolder than the rest, landed on a post not 10 feet from where Lucius stood. It tilted its head, fixed him with a beady black eye, and let out a caw that sounded, to his exhausted mind, like laughter. He stared back, wondering if this was what insanity felt like, wondering if he had finally snapped under the pressure. And then the crow did something that would haunt Lucius for the rest of his life. It hopped forward, pecked at a loose tile, and sent it crashing to the ground below. Then it looked at him again, cawed once more, and flew away to join its companions on the roof. The message was clear. Assuming birds could send messages. "We're not leaving. You're leaving. This is our home now." Lucius Vipsanius, tribune of Rome, veteran of campaigns and conqueror of men, sat down in the dirt and put his head in his hands. Somewhere above him, 1,000 birds continued their work. And somewhere in the darkness, a single sparrow chirped what might have been a command. The war continued, and the Romans were losing. The fourth day brought a new development that nobody had anticipated. The birds began targeting food supplies. It started small, just a few loaves of bread left unattended near the bakery, pecked into crumbs and scattered across the ground. Then a soldier discovered his morning ration had been stolen from his tent. The bag shredded, the contents vanished. By midday, the situation had escalated to the point where every meal required armed guards, and even then, the birds found ways through. They were clever. These sparrows, they had learned that humans valued their food, that taking it caused distress. That distress led to mistakes, and they exploited this knowledge with the ruthless efficiency of seasoned raiders. A soldier would sit down with his bowl of porridge, glance away for a single moment, and return his gaze to find a sparrow standing in the bowl, helping itself to breakfast. Another would reach for his bread and find it already occupied by a small, feathered creature that showed no fear, no hesitation, no respect for private property. The camp's food stores became a fortress within a fortress. Guards were posted at every entrance. Supplies were covered with heavy cloths weighted down with stones. Cooks worked in teams, watching each other's backs while they prepared meals. And still, the birds found ways in, through gaps in the roofing, through windows left slightly ajar, through the simple expedient of waiting until a door opened, and then darting through. Before anyone could react, Lucius Phipps received reports of these incidents with the hollow acceptance of a man who had run out of surprises. Of course, the birds were stealing food. Of course they were. Why wouldn't they? At this point, he half expected them to start demanding tribute in exchange for peace. The soldiers, meanwhile, had developed their own theories about what was happening. Some believed the birds were possessed by spirits, sent by the local Gauls to weaken the Roman forces before an attack. Others thought it was a punishment from the gods, divine retribution for some unspecified offense that nobody could remember committing. A few, the most superstitious, had begun leaving small offerings of grain outside their tents, hoping to appease their feathered tormentors. None of these theories were correct. Of course, the birds weren't possessed or divine or even particularly malicious. They were simply responding to their environment in the way that animals have always responded, by adapting, by learning, by finding new ways to survive. The Romans had destroyed their nests, so they fought back. The Romans had applied chili paste, so they found work. The Romans had guarded their food, so the birds got creative. That was adaptation, pure and simple. But to the exhausted, sleep-deprived soldiers, it felt like something more. It felt like war. That afternoon, a delegation of centurions came to Lucius with a proposal. They wanted permission to hunt the birds systematically, to use every weapon at their disposal until the skies were clear and the roofs were silent. They had drawn up plans, calculated ammunition requirements, even organized hunting parties with specific assignments and objectives. It was, they argued, the only remaining option. Total war. Lucius listened to their presentation with the patience of a man who had heard many bad ideas over the past few days. When they finished, he asked a single question. And how many birds do you think you can kill in a day? The lead centurion, a veteran named Gaius, who had fought in more battles than he could count, considered the question. 100, maybe 200, if we're efficient. And how many birds are there? Gaius opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was, nobody knew. Thousands, certainly. Tens of thousands, possibly. The original sparrows had been joined by so many other species that counting was impossible. Killing 200 a day would make no difference. It would be like trying to empty the ocean with a cup. So we do nothing. Another centurion demanded. We let them win. We find another way, Lucius replied. We think, we observe, we learn. The birds have been adapting to us. Perhaps it's time we started adapting to them. It was a surprisingly philosophical response from a man who had, until recently, believed that every problem could be solved by applying sufficient Roman force. But the past few days had changed Lucius Vipsanius. They had taught him humility, patience, and a deep respect for creatures he had previously dismissed as unimportant. The birds were teaching him to think differently, and for that, if nothing else, he was grateful. That night, instead of trying to fight the birds, Lucius watched them. He sat by his window with a wax tablet and stylus, taking notes on their behavior, their patterns, their preferences. He noted which roofs they targeted most frequently, which times of night they were most active, which species led the attacks, and which followed. He recorded everything, building a picture of his enemy that no Roman had ever attempted before. And as he watched, something remarkable happened. He began to see patterns that hadn't been visible before. The birds weren't just attacking randomly. They had leaders, scouts, specialized roles. Certain sparrows seemed to direct the others, chirping commands that the rest followed. Others focused on specific tasks, like pecking at tiles or stealing food or keeping watch for threats. It was organized. It was coordinated. It was, in its own way, almost military. Lucius sat back, his tablet full of observations, and felt something he hadn't felt in days. Curiosity. Not fear, not frustration, not exhaustion. Curiosity. He wanted to understand these creatures, to learn how they operated, to figure out what made them tick. And in that curiosity, he found the first glimmer of a new approach. Perhaps, he thought, the goal wasn't to defeat the birds. Perhaps the goal was to coexist with them, to find a balance that allowed both species to share this space without constant conflict. It was a very un-Roman thought. But at this point, Lucius was willing to try anything. Outside, the birds continued their nightly rituals, unaware that their human enemy was watching, learning, changing, and somewhere in the darkness, a single sparrow chirped what might have been the beginning of a new phase in this strange, unlikely war. The next morning, Lucius Vipsanius did something that no Roman tribune had ever done before, something that would have earned him ridicule in the halls of the Senate and disbelief from his fellow officers. He walked to the edge of the camp, sat down on a large rock, and began to watch the birds with the patient attention of a naturalist rather than a soldier. He brought bread with him, not to eat, but to offer. The soldiers who saw this from a distance exchanged worried glances. Their commander had finally snapped, they whispered. The birds had broken him. Soon he would be talking to the creatures, perhaps even singing to them. And then they would have to find someone else to lead them through this crisis. But Lucius hadn't snapped. He was experimenting. His theory was simple. If the birds were intelligent enough to wage war, perhaps they were intelligent enough to negotiate, not in the human sense, with treaties and terms and signed documents, but in the way that wild animals could sometimes be befriended, or at least tolerated, through consistent non-threatening behavior. He would show them that he was not a danger. He would offer food, not violence, and he would wait to see what happened. For the first hour, nothing happened. The birds went about their business, ignoring him completely. Sparrows landed nearby, gave him suspicious looks, and flew away. Crows circled overhead, cawing what sounded like warnings to their companions. A few bold starlings ventured close enough to inspect the bread, but darted away at the slightest movement. Lucius sat perfectly still, breathing slowly, willing himself to be patient. This was harder than it sounded. His legs cramped, his back ached. The sun beat down on his head with the kind of focused intensity that made you understand why Mediterranean peoples had such a complicated relationship with their climate. But he stayed, because staying was the only option he had left. Around the third hour, something shifted. A single sparrow, smaller than the others, and marked by a distinctive white patch on its chest, landed on the rock beside him. It was close enough to touch, close enough to see the individual feathers. The tiny black eyes that watched him with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Lucius held his breath, afraid that any movement would scare it away. The sparrow looked at him, looked at the bread, looked back at him, and then, with the casual confidence of a creature that had decided you were not a threat, it hopped onto the bread and began to peck. Lucius felt something he hadn't felt in days. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated, ridiculous joy. A bird was eating bread from his hand. Not just any bird, one of the enemy. One of the creatures that had been tormenting his camp for weeks. And it wasn't attacking, or stealing, or causing chaos. It was just eating, being a bird, living its life. More sparrows joined the first, emboldened by its example. Soon there were a dozen, then 2 dozen, then too many to count. They covered the rock, the ground around it, even Lucius himself, perching on his shoulders and knees with the casual familiarity of creatures that had decided he was furniture rather than foe. He sat there, covered in birds, and laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. The soldiers watching from a distance didn't know what to make of this. Their commander, covered in sparrows, laughing like a madman. It was either genius or insanity, and at this point, they weren't sure which was which. By evening, Lucius had made more progress with the birds than all the military tactics of the previous weeks combined. The sparrows no longer fled at his approach. They gathered when he appeared, expecting food, accepting his presence as normal. And more importantly, they had stopped attacking his section of the camp. The roofs near his quarters remained untouched, the tiles intact, the peace undisturbed. It was, he realized, a matter of territory. The birds weren't trying to conquer the camp, they were trying to defend their homes. When the Romans destroyed nests, the birds fought back. When the Romans offered food and peaceful coexistence, the birds responded in kind. They weren't monsters or demons or divine punishments. They were just creatures, trying to survive. And they had finally found a human who understood that. Lucius returned to his quarters that night with a plan. Not a military plan, but something gentler. Something that would have horrified his ancestors and confused his contemporaries. He would teach the soldiers to live with the birds. He would create zones where nesting was permitted, where food was available, where the birds could thrive without threatening Roman operations. And in return, he would ask only for peace. The soldiers, when he explained this plan the next morning, were skeptical. They had spent weeks hating these creatures, dreaming of their destruction, longing for the day when the skies would be empty and silence would reign. And now their commander wanted them to make friends, to share their food, to accept the birds as neighbors rather than enemies. But they were also exhausted. They had tried violence, and violence had failed. They had tried cleverness, and cleverness had been out. Perhaps, just perhaps, kindness might work where everything else had not. And so, reluctantly, they agreed to try. They set aside a section of the camp near the eastern wall, away from the main barracks and food stores. They built simple shelters, nothing fancy, just places where birds could nest without interfering with Roman operations. They left out food and water, regular offerings to their former enemies, and they waited to see what would happen. At first, nothing. The birds, suspicious after weeks of conflict, kept their distance. But slowly, gradually, they began to explore. A few sparrows checked out the shelters. A handful of starlings sampled the food. A single crow, the same one that had haunted Lucius's nightmares, landed on the eastern wall and surveyed the new arrangement with what might have been approval. And then, one by one, they began to move in. The eastern section of camp, once a forgotten corner, became a bustling avian community. Birds came and went at all hours, living their lives in full view of the soldiers who had once tried to destroy them. And the rest of the camp, the part the Romans actually needed, remained peaceful, quiet, bird-free. Lucius stood at the boundary between the two zones, watching his experiment unfold, and felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Satisfaction. Not victory, exactly, because victory implied conquest and the birds hadn't been conquered. But resolution, an end to conflict, a way forward that didn't require anyone to lose. Behind him, a sparrow chirped. It was the same one, he was almost certain. The small one with a white chest that had first taken bread from his hand. It perched on his shoulder now, comfortable, trusting, utterly unafraid. And Lucius, tribune of Rome, conqueror of men, stood perfectly still and let it stay. The peace held for exactly 6 days. On the 7th day, Caesar's advance scout arrived, and everything changed. His name was Decimus, and he was the kind of man who made other men uncomfortable without trying. Tall, lean, with eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that rarely smiled, he had served as Caesar's personal courier for years, carrying messages across Gaul with the kind of speed that made ordinary soldiers gasp. He arrived at midday, his horse lathered with sweat, his tunic dusty from the road, and his expression carefully neutral as he took in the scene before him. Because the scene before him was, by any reasonable standard, bizarre. Roman soldiers sat in small groups, eating their rations while sparrows hopped between their feet. Birds perched on tent poles, on equipment racks, even on the shoulders of men who should, by all rights, have been trying to kill them. A crow stood on the edge of the well, drinking from a bucket that someone had left out. Apparently for that exact purpose, Decimus dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in everything, filing it away for future reference. He had seen many strange things in his years of service: Gaulish warriors, painted blue, German shamans chanting curses, even a druid who claimed to talk to tries, but he had never seen a Roman camp that looked like an aviary. "Where can I find Tribune Vipsanius?" he asked the nearest soldier, a young man who was currently feeding bread crumbs to a sparrow perched on his knee. The soldier pointed toward the eastern section of camp, and Decimus walked in that direction, his boots crunching on the gravel path, his mind already composing the report he would deliver to Caesar. He found Lucius sitting on his favorite rock, surrounded by birds, looking like a man who had found peace in the most unlikely of places. "Tribune Vipsanius," Decimus said, his voice flat and official. "I bring word from Gaius Julius Caesar." Lucius stood, brushing bird droppings from his tunic, with a practiced motion that suggested this was a routine occurrence. "Speak. Caesar will arrive in 3 days. He expects to find this camp in proper condition, with troops trained, supplies organized, and all local issues resolved." Decimus paused, letting his gaze drift over the birds that surrounded them. "I trust that won't be a problem." It wasn't a question, but Lucius answered anyway. "The local issues have been resolved. Peacefully. As you can see." "I can see," Decimus replied, and his tone made it clear that what he saw was not what he would have chosen to see. "Caesar will be interested to hear how you achieved this resolution." Lucius felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Caesar's interest was not always a good thing. The general was famous for rewarding success, but he was equally famous for punishing anything that deviated from his vision of Roman military excellence. And Lucius suspected that a camp full of friendly birds was not part of that vision. The next 3 days were a frenzy of preparation. Soldiers cleaned their equipment, polished their armor, rehearsed their formations. Supplies were organized, inventories taken, reports written, and through it all, Lucius wrestled with a single, terrible question: what to do about the birds. The eastern zone remained peaceful, but the birds had expanded their territory slightly, venturing into other parts of the camp, now that the soldiers no longer threatened them. A few had even built nests in the main barracks, ignoring the carefully constructed shelters that had been provided for them. The soldiers, for their part, had grown so accustomed to their feathered neighbors that they no longer noticed them, eating and sleeping and training while birds went about their business all around. Lucius knew this would not impress Caesar. The general expected discipline, order, the clear separation between Roman and everything else. A camp where birds and men mingled freely would seem like chaos to him, a failure of command. a sign that the tribune in charge had lost control. But Lucius also knew that expelling the birds now would undo weeks of careful work. It would restart the conflict, bring back the sleepless nights, the destroyed roofs, the stolen food. And worse, it would feel like a betrayal. He had made peace with these creatures, had earned their trust, had promised them safety in exchange for their cooperation. Breaking that promise felt wrong, even if the creatures on the other side were just birds. On the evening before Caesar's arrival, Lucius made his decision. He would tell the general everything. The initial conflict, the failed tactics, the eventual solution. He would explain how the birds had outsmarted them, how adapting to the enemy had been more effective than fighting them, how peace had been achieved through patience rather than force. And he would hope that Caesar, for all his ambition and pride, would understand. That night, Lucius sat on his rock one last time, surrounded by his unlikely companions. The white-chested sparrow perched on his knee, chirping softly, as if sensing that something was about to change. Lucius stroked its feathers gently, feeling the tiny heartbeat beneath his fingers, and wondered what the morning would bring. Somewhere in the darkness, a crow cawed, and the sound was picked up by other birds, spreading through the camp like a wave. It wasn't an alarm or a warning, just communication. Birds talking to birds about whatever birds talked about. Lucius listened to it, this nighttime chorus that had once driven him to despair, and found it strangely comforting. Tomorrow, Caesar would come. Tomorrow, everything might change. But tonight, for this one moment, there was peace. And for Lucius Vipsanius, that was enough. Caesar arrived at midday, as the sun reached its peak and the camp baked under its relentless glare. He came with an escort of cavalry, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the air like golden fog. And with him came the full weight of Roman authority, of history, of expectations that weighed heavier than any armor. Lucius waited at the main gate, his officers arranged behind him in proper formation, the soldiers standing at attention in the background. Everything was as it should be, the camp neat, the troops presentable, the supplies organized. Only one thing was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that Lucius could do nothing about. The birds had come to watch. They perched on every available surface: the walls, the gateposts, the roofs of nearby buildings. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, their small eyes fixed on the approaching general with the same curiosity they had once shown Lucius. A few of the bolder ones had even landed on the soldiers' shoulders, ignoring the stiff postures and frozen expressions of men who desperately wanted to shoo them away but dared not move. Caesar reined in his horse at the gate and sat for a long moment, taking in the scene. His face revealed nothing, no surprise, no amusement, no anger. He was, as always, completely unreadable, a mask of calm that had disconcerted enemies and allies alike for decades. "Tribune Vipsanius," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to shout. "You have an interesting approach to camp security." Lucius stepped forward and saluted. "General, if I may explain, you may, but not here, in the dust and heat. Walk with me." Caesar dismounted, handing his reins to an aide, and began walking into the camp without waiting to see if Lucius would follow. Lucius followed, because of course he followed. Because when Caesar invited you to walk with him, you walked out. They passed through the main gate, past the rows of soldiers standing at attention, past the supply tents and the training grounds and the well where the crow still perched, watching everything with its dark, intelligent eyes. Caesar noted it all, filing away details, building his mental picture of what had happened here. "Tell me about the birds," he said, when they were far enough from the troops that their conversation would be private. "Tell me everything. Don't spare the details, and don't try to make yourself look better than you are. I'll know if you're lying," Lucius told him. He started with the heat wave, the nests, the sleepless nights. He described the decision to remove the nests, the first night of retaliation, the failed owl statues, the chilly paste that created smarter birds. He admitted his mistakes freely: the underestimation of the enemy, the assumption that Roman methods would always work, the slow, humbling realization that he had been wrong about almost everything. And then he described the solution: not a military victory, but an accommodation, learning to live with the birds rather than fighting them, creating space for them, earning their trust, finding a balance that allowed both species to coexist. He described the white-chested sparrow, the crow that seemed to watch him, the strange peace that had settled over the camp when the fighting stopped. Caesar listened without interrupting, his face still unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind those calm, calculating eyes. When Lucius finished, they had circled the entire camp and were approaching the eastern zone, where the birds had their shelters and the soldiers had learned to share their space. They stopped at the boundary, watching the activity within. Birds came and went freely, landing on roofs and perches, interacting with soldiers who moved among them without fear or hostility. It was, Lucius realized, a scene that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. "Tell me," Caesar said quietly, "do you think the birds understand what they've achieved? Do they know they've done something no enemy army has ever done?" Lucius considered the question carefully. "I don't think they think about it that way, General. They're just living, responding to their environment. We were a threat, so they fought us. We stopped being a threat, so they stopped fighting. It's not strategy, not really. It's just survival." "Survival," Caesar repeated, rolling the word around as if tasting it. "And yet, they won, not by defeating us in battle, but by outlasting us, by adapting faster than we could, by being willing to do whatever it took to protect their homes." Sound familiar? Lucius blinked. "General, the Gauls, Tribune, the Germans, every people we've ever conquered, they fought us because we threatened their homes, their families, their way of life. And sometimes, even when we won, they kept fighting in other ways, adapting, surviving, waiting for their moment. The birds have taught you something that most Roman commanders never learn. They've taught you to see the enemy as something other than an obstacle to be removed." Caesar turned to face him, and for the first time, Lucius saw something like approval in those calm eyes. "You made mistakes here, serious mistakes. You underestimated your opponent. You escalated a conflict that didn't need to escalate. And you let your frustration drive your decisions. But in the end, you learned, you adapted, you found a solution that preserved your forces and achieved your objective. Even if it wasn't the solution you originally intended. That's not failure, Tribune. That's growth." Lucius felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "So you're not displeased?" Caesar actually smiled, a rare expression that transformed his face entirely. "I'm fascinated. When I return to Rome, I may write about this. How sparrows taught a Roman tribune to think like a Gaul. It would make an excellent chapter." They stood together at the boundary, watching the birds, and for a moment, Lucius allowed himself to believe that everything would be all right. The war was over. Peace had been achieved, and Caesar, of all people, understood. Then the white-chested sparrow landed on Caesar's shoulder, and the general's expression shifted into something that Lucius couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or amusement, or something else entirely. "Extraordinary," Caesar murmured, not moving, not startling the bird. "They really have no fear." "No, General, not anymore." Caesar turned to look at him, and there was something new in his eyes now. Respect, maybe, or calculation. With Caesar, it was always hard to tell. "You've created something remarkable here, Tribune, a different kind of peace, built on understanding rather than conquest. I'm not sure it would work everywhere, or with every enemy, but it worked here, and that's worth something." He reached up slowly, carefully, and the sparrow hopped onto his finger, accepting the touch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Caesar studied it for a long moment, this tiny creature that had caused so much trouble, and then gently set it back on his shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, "we discuss your next assignment. But tonight, I think I'd like to sit on that rock of yours and watch the birds, if you don't mind." Lucius didn't mind, not at all. That evening, the camp experienced something it had never known before, a shared meal between soldiers and their general. With birds as honored guests, Caesar, against all protocol and tradition, had ordered the officers to set up tables in the open air, near the eastern zone where the birds had made their home. He wanted, he said, to observe the creatures in their natural habitat. And if that meant eating outside like a common soldier, so be it. The soldiers didn't know what to make of this. Generals did not eat with the rank and file. Generals did not sit on rough wooden benches and reach for the same bread as everyone else. Generals certainly did not allow sparrows to land on their shoulders while they ate, pecking at crumbs that fell from their hands. And yet, here was Caesar, doing exactly that. As if it were the most normal thing in the world. Lucius sat at the general's right hand, still processing the events of the day. Caesar had not only accepted the situation, he had embraced it. He asked questions constantly, about the birds, about their behavior, about the soldiers' reactions to living alongside them. He wanted to know which birds were boldest, which kept their distance, which species interacted with which. He was, Lucius realized, conducting research, gathering intelligence, treating the avian community as seriously as he would treat any potential enemy or ally. The white-chested sparrow had adopted Caesar as its new favorite perch. It moved from his shoulder to his knee, to the table in front of him, always watching, always present. as if it understood that this human was important and deserved special attention. Caesar seemed genuinely charmed by this, though with him, it was hard to tell. "You've given me an idea, Tribune," Caesar said between bites of bread and cheese. "A new approach to certain problems we've been facing in Gaul." Lucius waited, knowing better than to interrupt. "The Gaulish tribes fight us because they fear us. They fear what we'll do to their homes, their families, their way of life. We've tried overwhelming force, and it works, but it's expensive. It costs lives, Roman lives, and every life lost is a life that could have been spent building something rather than destroying it." He paused, watching a sparrow chase another sparrow across the table. "But what if we could make them understand that we're not a threat? What if we could find a way to coexist, to share the land, to create spaces where both Romans and Gauls could thrive without constant conflict? It would take time, more time than conquest. It would take patience, which Romans don't have in abundance. But it might also create something lasting, something that wouldn't require constant garrisons and repeated campaigns." Lucius considered this. "You're talking about applying bird lessons to human problems." "I'm talking about learning from whatever teacher presents itself. The birds taught you that force isn't always the answer. They taught you that understanding the enemy can be more valuable than defeating them. They taught you that peace is possible, even with creatures that seem fundamentally incompatible with your way of life." Why shouldn't those lessons apply to Gauls as well? It was a radical idea, the kind of idea that would have gotten most men laughed out of the Senate. But Caesar wasn't most men, and he wasn't speaking to the Senate. He was speaking to a junior tribune who had accidentally pioneered a new form of conflict resolution, and he was thinking out loud, testing ideas, seeing how they sounded when spoken aloud. The evening wore on, the sun setting in brilliant oranges and purples, the birds settling into their nightly routines. Soldiers finished their meals and drifted away, leaving the officers to their conversation. And through it all, Caesar kept talking, kept questioning, kept exploring the implications of what Lucius had created. By the time darkness fell, Lucius understood something he hadn't understood before. Caesar wasn't just a general or a politician. He was a student of human nature, of all nature, constantly seeking patterns, connections, insights that others missed. The birds interested him not because they were unusual, but because they revealed something universal about conflict and coexistence, about how creatures responded to threats and opportunities. And Lucius, in his accidental way, had given him a new lens through which to view the world. Later that night, long after Caesar had retired to his quarters, Lucius sat on his rock one more time. The white-chested sparrow found him there, as it always did, perching on his knee and chirping softly in the darkness. Lucius stroked its feathers gently, feeling the familiar heartbeat, the warmth of a small body against his hand. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the bird, "everything changes. Caesar will leave, and we'll go back to our regular routines. But you'll still be here, won't you? You and your family and your friends, living your lives alongside us, and maybe that's the way it should be." The sparrow chirped, whether in agreement or simply because that's what sparrows did. Lucius couldn't say, but in that moment, it felt like understanding. It felt like peace. Somewhere in the camp, a crow cawed and the sound was picked up by other birds, a nighttime chorus that no longer sounded like an attack. It sounded like home. Caesar departed at dawn, taking his cavalry escort, and leaving behind a camp that would never quite be the same. Before he left, he summoned Lucius for a private conversation that would echo in the tribune's memory for decades. "Your assignment here continues," Caesar said, mounting his horse with the easy grace of a man who had spent more hours in the saddle than most people spent on their feet. "But I'm adding something to your duties. Observe the birds. Record their behavior. Note how they interact with the soldiers, how they adapt to changes in the camp, how they respond to different situations. Keep a journal, detailed and regular. When I return, I want to read it." Lucius blinked. "You want me to? Study birds. I want you to continue learning from them. The Gauls have their druids, who claim to understand the natural world in ways we don't. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps there's knowledge there that we've been too arrogant to seek. You've stumbled onto something, Tribune. Don't let it go to waste." And then he was gone, riding east toward the next campaign, the next conquest, the next challenge. Lucius watched until the dust settled and the horizon was empty, then turned back to his camp, his soldiers, his birds. The weeks that followed were the strangest of his life. He established a routine: mornings for military duties, afternoons for observation and note-taking, evenings on his rock with the white-chested sparrow. His journal grew thick with observations, sketches, theories about bird behavior and social structure. He learned to identify individual sparrows by their markings, their calls, their personalities. He mapped their territories, documented their conflicts, recorded their responses to everything from weather changes to new soldiers arriving in camp. The soldiers, initially amused by their commander's hobby, gradually accepted it as normal. Some even developed their own relationships with particular birds, learning to recognize the ones that visited their tents, the ones that seemed to prefer their company. A few began keeping their own informal notes, sharing observations with Lucius, contributing to the growing body of knowledge about their feathered neighbors. The white-chested sparrow became something of a celebrity. Soldiers called it Little Caesar, in honor of the general who had let it perch on his shoulder. It seemed to enjoy the attention, strutting through the camp with the confidence of a creature that knew it was special, knew it was protected, knew it could go anywhere and do anything without fear. And through it all, the peace held. The birds nested in the eastern zone, raised their young, lived their lives. They ventured into other parts of the camp, yes, but always with the casual confidence of residents, rather than invaders. They took food that was offered, ignored food that wasn't, and generally behaved like creatures that had reached an understanding with their human neighbors. Lucius sometimes wondered if the birds understood how unusual this was. Did they know that elsewhere in the empire, Romans killed birds without a second thought? Did they realize that their little corner of Gaul was unique, a tiny experiment in coexistence that had no parallel anywhere else? Probably not, he decided. They were just birds, living their lives, taking things as they came. The philosophy was, in its own way, admirable. Summer faded into autumn, the heat giving way to cooler days and longer nights. The birds changed with the season, their behavior shifting in ways that Lucius documented carefully. Some species departed entirely, migrating to warmer places. Others stayed, fluffing their feathers against the cold, huddling together in their shelters. The sparrows, including Little Caesar, remained, adapted, survived. Winter brought snow, the first Lucius had seen in years. The camp transformed, roofs white instead of brown, paths slippery with ice, breaths visible in the cold air. The birds struggled, finding food harder to come by, huddling together for warmth. Lucius ordered extra rations put out for them, grain and crumbs and whatever else could be spared. The soldiers grumbled about feeding birds when they themselves were cold and hungry, but they did it anyway, because by now it was habit, because the birds were part of the camp, because driving them away would have felt wrong. Little Caesar grew thinner, its feathers fluffed against the cold, but it survived. It still came to Lucius each evening, perching on his knee, accepting the warmth of his hand, chirping softly in the darkness. Lucius talked to it sometimes, telling it about his day, his worries, his hopes for the future. It probably didn't understand, but that didn't matter. The talking helped, and the listening helped. And somewhere in that exchange of sound and presence, something like friendship existed. Spring arrived eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, the days lengthened, and the birds that had departed returned, filling the camp with songs that Lucius now recognized as individual calls, rather than meaningless noise. New chicks hatched, including a brood from Little Caesar, who had found a mate during the cold months, and was now raising a family in a nest near Lucius's quarters. Lucius watched the chicks grow, documenting their development, their personalities, their place in the sparrow community. He gave them names, though he knew he shouldn't. Knew that naming wild creatures was the first step toward treating them as something other than what they were. But he named them anyway. Swift for the one that learned to fly first, bold for the one that approached humans without fear, quiet for the one that rarely chirped, preferring to observe the world in silence. And through it all, he kept his journal, filling page after page with observations that would have seemed absurd to any other Roman officer. But Caesar had asked for it, and Caesar's requests were commands. And besides, Lucius had come to enjoy the work. It gave structure to his days, purpose to his hours, a reason to pay attention to the small things that most people overlooked. Summer returned, and with it, news. Caesar was coming back. He had conquered more tribes, expanded the borders of the empire, added to his legend, and he wanted to see Lucius's journal, wanted to read the observations that had accumulated over the past year. Lucius prepared for the general's arrival with a mixture of excitement and dread. His journal was thick, detailed, full of things that no Roman had ever written before. Would Caesar find it valuable, interesting, or would he laugh at the absurdity of a Roman tribune who had spent a year watching birds? There was only one way to find out, and so Lucius waited, as he had waited before, sitting on his rock with Little Caesar on his knee, watching the horizon for the dust that would signal the general's approach. Caesar arrived on a golden afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the camp. The birds going about their evening routines as if the most powerful man in Gaul wasn't riding through their midst. This time, there was no formal reception, no troops standing at attention. Lucius had decided, after much thought, that the camp would present itself as it truly was, not as some polished illusion of military perfection. Caesar noticed immediately. He dismounted at the gate, alone this time, his escort hanging back as he walked through the camp like an ordinary visitor. He paused to watch a group of soldiers, sharing their rations with smiled slightly at a crow that landed on a post and fixed him with its dark gaze, and eventually made his way to the eastern zone, where Lucius waited on his rock. "Tribune," Caesar said, settling onto the ground beside him, with none of the formality their positions required. "Show me what you've learned." Lucius handed over the journal, a thick stack of wax tablets bound with leather, covered in his cramped handwriting. Caesar took it carefully, almost reverently, and began to read. The silence stretched. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds came and went, landing near them, investigating, moving on. Little Caesar perched on Lucius's knee, watching Caesar with the same curiosity it showed all visitors. Finally, Caesar looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something Lucius hadn't seen before. Wonder, perhaps, or the excitement of discovery. "You've documented things here that no one has ever documented," Caesar said quietly. "The social structure of their communication patterns, their responses to environmental changes, their individual personalities. This isn't just a journal, Tribune, this is a scientific work, a contribution to human knowledge." Lucius felt heat rise to his cheeks. "I just wrote down what I saw. That's what all great observers say. But most people don't see what you've seen. Most people look at birds and see a flock, a mass, an undifferentiated crowd. You've seen individuals. You've recognized that each bird is different, with its own character, its own place in the community. That's rare. That's valuable." Caesar returned to the journal, flipping through pages, pausing at sketches and observations. "You've noted that certain birds consistently take leadership roles in foraging, that others specialize in warning calls, that conflicts are resolved through ritualized displays rather than actual violence. These are the same patterns we see in human societies. Simplified, perhaps, but recognizable. The birds have been teaching you about politics without you even realizing it." Lucius considered this. "I never thought of it that way. Most people don't. That's why most people never learn anything from nature. They see it as separate, other, beneath their notice. But you've spent a year watching, recording, thinking. You've done what philosophers claim to do, but rarely accomplish. You've observed the world as it actually is, not as you assume it to be." Caesar closed the journal and handed it back. "I'm taking you with me when I leave." Lucius blinked. "General, you're wasted here. Any competent officer can manage this camp. But how many officers can do what you've done? How many can observe, document, analyze? I need people like you, Tribune. People who see clearly, who think carefully, who learn from unexpected sources. The Gauls are full of knowledge we haven't tapped, wisdom we've been too arrogant to seek. You've proven you can find it, even in Imagine what you could learn from actual druids, actual tribes, actual people who've lived on this land for generations." It was an offer Lucius had never imagined, a path he had never considered. Leave this quiet camp, this peaceful routine, these birds that had become his companions. Travel with Caesar, observe new peoples, document new knowledge. It was terrifying and exciting in equal measure. "When," he asked, "tomorrow, at dawn, I need you on the next campaign. There are tribes in the West that no Roman has ever encountered. Customs we don't understand. Languages we don't speak. You'll learn them. You'll document them. You'll help me understand the people we're trying to conquer. So that maybe, just maybe, we can find ways to coexist rather than simply destroy." Lucius looked down at little Caesar, perched on his knee, chirping softly in the fading light. The sparrow seemed to sense something had changed, tilting its head, fixing him with those tiny black eyes. "What about them?" Lucius asked, gesturing at the birds. "The camp, the life he'd built here. They'll be here when you return, or they won't. That's the nature of life, Tribune. Nothing stays the same forever. But what you've learned from them, what they've taught you, that stays. That goes with you wherever you travel, whatever you do. The birds have given you a gift. Don't waste it by clinging to them too tightly." Lucius nodded slowly, understanding dawning. This was the lesson he hadn't expected. The final teaching from his feathered teachers. Attachment was natural, but so was change. Love what you have while you have it, and let it go when you must. The birds did that every day, every season, every migration. They didn't cling to the past. They lived in the present and trusted the future. That night, Lucius sat on his rock for the last time, surrounded by birds that had become his family. Little Caesar stayed on his knee for hours, long past its usual bedtime, as if it too understood that something was ending. Lucius talked to it quietly, telling it things he'd never told anyone, sharing fears and hopes and dreams that had no other outlet. When dawn came, he was ready. He packed his few possessions, including the journal. Now thicker than ever, he said goodbye to his officers, his soldiers, the camp that had been his home. And finally, he walked to the eastern zone, where the birds were beginning their morning routines. Little Caesar was there, waiting on the rock. Lucius approached slowly, sat down one last time, and let the sparrow hop onto his hand. They sat together for a long moment, human and bird, friends in a way that neither could fully explain. "Thank you," Lucius whispered, "for everything." He gently set the sparrow back on the rock, stood, and walked away without looking back. Behind him, little Caesar chirped once, twice, 3 times. It might have been a farewell. It might have been a simple bird sound, meaning nothing at all. Lucius chose to believe it was a farewell. It made the leaving easier, and the leaving was hard enough already. Caesar waited at the gate, mounted on his horse, his expression patient. Lucius climbed onto his own horse, settled his belongings, and took one last look at the camp that had taught him so much. "Ready?" Caesar asked. Lucius nodded. "Ready." They rode east, toward the rising sun, toward new campaigns and new knowledge, and a future no one could predict. And behind them, in a camp that would never quite be the same, a small sparrow with a white chest sat on a rock and watched them go. The Western campaign lasted 8 months, and Lucius Vipsanius discovered that observing humans was both easier and harder than observing birds. Easier because humans, at least, spoke languages that could eventually be learned and understood. Harder because humans lied, concealed, performed for observers in ways that birds never did. A sparrow couldn't pretend to be something it wasn't. A Gaulish tribesman absolutely could, and often did. Lucius kept his journal religiously, filling tablet after tablet with observations about the tribes they encountered. He documented their customs, their beliefs, their social structures. He noted which tribes greeted the Romans with curiosity rather than hostility, which ones fought to the last warrior, which ones tried to negotiate. He recorded details that other officers ignored: what they ate, how they dressed, what stories they told their children. Caesar read every entry, often asking questions that pushed Lucius to dig deeper. Why do they sacrifice cattle in that particular way? What's the significance of the blue paint on their faces? Who makes the decisions when the chieftain is away? The questions never stopped, and Lucius learned to see the world through Caesar's eyes, always searching for patterns, meanings, connections. But through it all, he thought about the birds. Not constantly, but often enough. In quiet moments between battles, during long marches, in the darkness before sleep, he found himself wondering about little Caesar and its family. Were they still there? Had they survived the winter? Did they remember him, or had he already faded from their tiny sparrow memories? He mentioned this to Caesar once, during a rare evening when they sat together away from the troops. The general listened without comment, then asked a question that Lucius hadn't expected. "Do you think they missed you?" Lucius considered this carefully. "I don't know. I don't think birds have the same kind of memory we do. They live in the present, mostly, but they also form attachments, recognize individuals, remember who's friendly and who's dangerous. So maybe, in their way, they notice my absence. Maybe they wonder where I went." Caesar nodded slowly. "That's the thing about leaving, Tribune. You carry the absence with you, but so do those you leave behind. The bonds you formed don't disappear just because you're not there anymore. They exist in memory, in habit, in the small ways that creatures adjust to each other's presence. The birds learn to trust you. That trust doesn't vanish overnight. It fades, perhaps, if it's not reinforced, but it leaves traces." It was the most philosophical Lucius had ever heard. Caesar be, and he filed the moment away in his memory, knowing it was rare and precious. The campaign ended in early summer, with most of the Western tribes either defeated or negotiated into submission. Caesar was pleased, though his pleasure was always tempered by the knowledge that more work remained. Gaul was vast, and the Romans had barely scratched its surface. They returned to the main camp, the one where Lucius had spent the previous year, arriving on an afternoon much like the one when Caesar had first visited. The soldiers turned out to greet them, forming ranks, saluting as the general rode through. Lucius scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces. Finding many dot, and then he looked toward the eastern zone, and his heart stopped. The birds were still there, thousands of them, going about their business as if nothing had changed. And on the rock where he had spent so many evenings, a small shape sat watching, waiting. White chest, familiar posture, impossible to mistake. Lucius dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, handing the reins to a startled aide, and walked toward the eastern zone. He didn't run, because running would have been undignified, but his pace was faster than it should have been, faster than protocol allowed. Little Caesar watched him approach, head tilted, eyes fixed on the human who had returned. And when Lucius was close enough, when he reached the rock and sat down heavily, the sparrow hopped onto his knee, as if no time had passed at all. Lucius laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising him with its joy. 8 months. 8 months of campaigning, of battles, of observing strange peoples in strange lands. And this tiny creature, this bird with a white chest, had waited, had remembered, had trusted that he would return. He sat on the rock for a long time, letting the birds gather around him, letting them inspect him, chirp at him, remind him that he belonged here too. Little Caesar never left his knee, occasionally pecking gently at his hand, as if to confirm that he was real, that this wasn't a dream. The soldiers who saw this exchanged glances and smiles. Their commander, the Birdman, had come home. The camp felt complete again. That evening, Lucius wrote in his journal for the first time in weeks, documenting his return, his reunion, his renewed appreciation for the small creatures that had taught him so much. He wrote about little Caesar's patience, about the trust that had survived 8 months of separation, about the strange and wonderful bond that existed between a Roman tribune and a sparrow. And when he finished, he sat on his rock as the sun set, surrounded by birds, and felt something he hadn't felt in all his months of campaigning. Peace. Complete, absolute, unshakable peace. Little Caesar chirped softly, snuggling against his hand, and Lucius smiled into the darkness. Some things, he realized, were worth coming home to. Some bonds transcended species, time, distance. Some friendships were simply meant to be. The years that followed blurred into a rhythm that Lucius had never anticipated for himself. Campaigns with Caesar, returns to the camp, always the birds. He became known throughout the legions as something of an oddity, the tribune who studied sparrows, who talked to birds, who had more in common with the local wildlife than with his fellow officers. But they said it with affection now, not mockery, because everyone had heard the story. Everyone knew how the birds had once defeated the Romans. Everyone understood that Lucius Vipsanius had achieved something remarkable. Little Caesar grew old. In sparrow years, 8 months was a significant portion of a lifetime, and Lucius had been gone for 8 months. The white-chested sparrow that greeted him on his return was noticeably slower, less energetic, more content to perch quietly rather than dart about investigating everything. Its feathers were less sleek, its eyes a bit clouded, its movements more deliberate. Lucius noticed these changes with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. This was the way of things. He knew birds lived short lives, burned bright, faded fast. Little Caesar had already outlived most of its original flock, had raised multiple broods of chicks, had established itself as a patriarch of the sparrow community. It had earned its rest. But still, every evening, it came to the rock. Every evening, it perched on Lucius's knee and chirped softly. And Lucius talked to it about his day, his thoughts, his memories of their time together. It had become a ritual, a sacred practice, the most important part of his daily routine. The other birds came and went, but little Caesar remained, patient and present, a living connection to the past. Lucius sometimes wondered if the sparrow understood how much it meant to him, how its steady presence had anchored him through years of chaos and change. Probably not, he decided, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that it was there, that it stayed, that it trusted him enough to spend its final days in his company. The winter of 54 BCE was brutal, the coldest in decades. Snow piled high, burying the camp, cutting off supplies, testing the endurance of everyone and everything. Lucius worried constantly about the birds, about little Caesar most of all. He set out extra food, created sheltered spaces, did everything he could to help them survive. Many didn't. Spring revealed the bodies of birds that had succumbed to the cold, frozen in their nests, their tiny forms, a silent testament to winter's cruelty. Lucius found them as he made his rounds, burying each one with a quiet word of thanks for the life it had lived. Little Caesar survived. Somehow, impossibly, the old sparrow made it through the worst winter in memory, emerging in spring thin and weak but alive. It came to the rock on the first warm day, hopping onto Lucius's knee with visible effort, chirping a greeting that sounded exhausted but triumphant. Lucius wept. He didn't mean to, didn't plan to, but the relief was too great, the emotion too overwhelming. He sat on his rock with tears streaming down his face, holding this tiny creature that had become so much a part of his life, and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back for months. Little Caesar didn't seem bothered by the tears. It perched contentedly, occasionally pecking gently at his fingers, chirping soft reassurances that might have meant nothing or might have meant everything. That summer, Caesar summoned Lucius for what would be their last conversation. The general was preparing for his final campaigns, the ones that would complete the conquest of Gaul and set the stage for the civil wars to come. He had heard about the brutal winter, about the birds that had died, about little Caesar's survival. "Your sparrow," Caesar said, "is remarkable. Most creatures its age would have given up, but it fought, survived, returned to you. There's a lesson there, Tribune, about loyalty, about persistence, about the things worth fighting for." Lucius nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "When this is all over," Caesar continued, "when Gaul is pacified and Rome is stable and have done what I need to do, I want you to write it all down. The story of the birds, what they taught you, what they taught me. It deserves to be remembered, not just as an oddity, but as proof that wisdom can come from anywhere, that even the smallest creatures have something to teach us." "I will, General," Lucius said. "I promise." Caesar smiled, that rare expression that transformed his face. "Good. Now go home to your birds. Spend as much time with them as you can. You never know how much you have left." It was, Lucius would realize later, a farewell. Caesar was already looking ahead, already planning the next phase of his life, already preparing for the conflicts that would define his legacy. He wouldn't return to this quiet camp, wouldn't sit on this rock, wouldn't watch the birds again. But Lucius would. Lucius would stay, and watch, and remember. It was, he decided, a good way to spend a life. The end came quietly, as endings often do. No dramatic final moment, no heroic last stand. Just an evening in late summer, warm and golden. The kind of evening that made you believe the world was fundamentally good. Lucius sat on his rock as always, waiting for little Caesar to appear. The sparrow was later than usual, which happens sometimes. Age had slowed it, made its routines less predictable. Lucius wasn't worried, not yet. Just patient. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds settled into their evening perches, their songs gradually fading as darkness approached. And still, little Caesar didn't come. Lucius stood, finally, and walked toward the eastern zone, where the sparrows had their nests. He moved slowly, carefully, not wanting to disturb anyone. The other birds watched him pass, their familiar human, but none raised an alarm. He was part of the community now, accepted, trusted. He found little Caesar near the back of the zone, tucked into a sheltered spot beneath a low bush. The sparrow was lying on its side, breathing shallowly, its eyes half closed. When Lucius approached, it opened its eyes fully and chirped once, softly, a sound that seemed to say, "You came." Lucius sat down in the dirt, not caring about his uniform, not caring about anything except this moment. He reached out gently, letting his hand rest beside the tiny body, not touching, just present. Little Caesar shifted slightly, pressing against his fingers, seeking warmth. They stayed like that as the light faded, as the stars emerged, as the camp settled into nighttime quiet. Lucius talked softly, telling the sparrow things he'd never told anyone, how much it meant to him, how it had changed his life, how he would never forget the creature that had taught him to see the world differently. Little Caesar listened, or seemed to. Its breathing slowed further, its eyes closing for longer periods between opening. But each time it opened them, it looked at Lucius, and each look seemed to say, "I'm still here. I'm still with you." Near midnight, with the moon rising full and bright, little Caesar took one last breath and was still. Lucius felt the moment, felt the absence where presence had been, felt the silence where there had always been chirping. He didn't cry. He was too tired for tears, too full of gratitude for grief. He sat for a long time with the tiny body, this creature that had given him so much, and thanked it silently for every moment they'd shared. Finally, he stood, lifting little Caesar gently, cradling it in his palm. He carried it to a special place he'd prepared years ago, a small garden near the rock where they'd spent so many evenings. He'd buried other birds there, ones that hadn't survived the winters, ones that had died of old age or accident. Little Caesar would join them, surrounded by friends, resting in the place it had loved. He dug a small hole with his hands, lined it with soft leaves, and laid the sparrow inside. He covered it gently, marked the spot with a small stone, and stood in silence for a long moment. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The other birds watched from their perches, silent and still. They knew, somehow. They understood that something important had happened, that one of their own had passed, that their human was grieving. A few flew down to land near him, perching on his shoulders, his knees, offering what comfort they could. Lucius stayed in the garden until dawn, surrounded by birds, keeping vigil for the friend he'd lost. When the sun rose, painting the world in new light, he finally stood and walked back to his quarters. There was work to do, a camp to run, a life to continue. But something had changed, something fundamental, and he knew he would never be quite the same. In the weeks that followed, Lucius began to write, not just observations, but the story itself. The story of a hot summer, angry soldiers, and birds that refused to be defeated. The story of a war that shouldn't have happened, and a peace that shouldn't have been possible. The story of a small sparrow with a white chest that changed everything. He wrote slowly, carefully, choosing each word with the same attention he'd given to observing the birds. He wrote for himself, for Caesar, for anyone who might someday want to understand what had happened here. He wrote to remember, to honor, to ensure that little Caesar's legacy would outlast even the longest memory. And when he finished, he sat on his rock one evening, surrounded by the descendants of the birds he'd first known, and felt peace settle over him like a blanket. The war was over. The peace had held. And somewhere, in a place beyond knowing, a small sparrow with a white chest was chirping softly, watching over him still. The years passed. Lucius grew old, as all things do. He never left the camp permanently, though he traveled occasionally, always returning to the rock, the garden, the birds. He trained successors, passed on his knowledge, ensured that the observation would continue after he was gone. When his time came, he was ready. He'd lived a full life, a strange life, a life that no one could have predicted. He'd learned from sparrows, befriended a general, documented things no one else had ever documented. He'd loved and lost and loved. Again, always with the birds as his companions, his teachers, his friends. They buried him near the garden, close to the rock, where he'd spent so many evenings. The birds attended the funeral, as they always attended everything in that camp, perching on every available surface, watching in silence as their human was laid to rest. And when the ceremony ended, when the soldiers dispersed and the camp returned to its routines, one bird landed on the rock and chirped. It was a young sparrow, barely a year old, marked by a small white patch on its chest. It sat there for a long time, watching the garden, watching the spot where Lucius lay, chirping softly in the evening light. The sound was picked up by other birds, spreading through the camp like a wave, a chorus of chirps and calls that filled the air with music. It wasn't a sad sound, exactly. More like a celebration, a recognition, a thank you to the human who had understood them, who had made peace with them, who had loved them enough to stay. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The birds settled into their nests, their songs gradually fading into silence. And in the garden, beneath a small stone marker, Lucius Vipsanius rested at last, surrounded by the creatures he'd loved, at peace in the place he'd called home. End of script. Sweet dreams.